The bombs did not fall quietly. They fell in waves. They fell in schedules. They fell as policy. From 1965 onward, the sky above Vietnam became a ledger. Every explosion an entry. Every village a coordinate. Every crater a calculation. Washington called it escalation control. Hanoi called it survival. The villagers called it something else entirely. Operation Rolling Thunder was not chaos. It was bureaucratized violence. Targets were debated in conference rooms thousands of miles away. Bridges, rail yards, fuel depots. Then, inevitably, areas where fighters were suspected to move among civilians. The logic was clean. Apply pressure, raise cost, break will. But wars are not spreadsheets. The bombs did not break North Vietnam's will. They hardened it. And in the south, something else was happening. Napalm does not discriminate between ideology and skin. It clings. It consumes oxygen. It turns landscape into warning. Search and destroy missions followed airstrikes. Helicopters dropped infantry into villages suspected of harboring insurgents. Body counts became performance metrics. The higher the number, the closer victory seemed. But numbers lie. When a war measures success by corpses, it begins to misread the living. Then came My Lai. Not as an isolated eruption of madness, but as the predictable outcome of a system that incentivized kill ratios over control, suspicion over verification, aggression over patience. Hundreds of civilians dead, old men, women, children. The photographs did not ask for interpretation. They simply existed. And once they existed, the narrative cracked. This is where the failure begins. Not at the evacuation of Saigon, not at the signing table in Paris. It begins when a superpower convinces itself that overwhelming force can substitute for political legitimacy. The United States entered Vietnam with unmatched industrial capacity. It could move steel across oceans. It could deploy aircraft carriers like floating cities. It could drop more explosives than were used in entire theaters of World War II. But it could not manufacture consent in a countryside it did not understand. And when consent collapses, force expands. That expansion is where war crimes breed. Because when victory does not arrive on schedule, pressure moves downward. From presidents to generals to colonels to lieutenants to 19-year-olds holding rifles in unfamiliar villages. Orders become ambiguous. Rules blur. Fear sharpens. And somewhere between frustration and fatigue, lines are crossed. Not always out of hatred. Sometimes out of exhaustion. Sometimes out of revenge. Sometimes because the system rewards results without interrogating how they were achieved. Vietnam became a laboratory for escalation without resolution. Bomb harder, sweep wider, count higher, report progress. But beneath the reports, something was eroding. Not just villages. Credibility. The United States did not fail in Vietnam because it lacked firepower. It failed because it tried to convert firepower into political submission. And when submission did not materialize, it escalated into actions that corroded its own moral foundation. War crimes are not always born from sadism. Often, they are born from strategy that refuses to admit miscalculation. This chapter is not about individual monsters. It is about structural pressure. When a system defines victory incorrectly, It begins to justify methods that ensure defeat. Vietnam was not lost in a single battle. It was lost the moment overwhelming violence became the primary language of persuasion. And once a nation speaks only in that language, it must keep speaking louder, or admit it was wrong. America chose louder. That choice reshaped the war. In the next chapter, we move backward, before the bombs, before the body counts, back to the assumption that made all of this possible. The belief that America could not lose. That belief was the first miscalculation, and everything after was escalation. Before Vietnam was a jungle war, before it was helicopters and body bags, before it was protest chants and draft cards. It was an assumption built in 1945. The United States exited the Second World War not just victorious, but transformed into something unprecedented. Its industrial base had outproduced entire continents. Its navy controlled oceans. Its air power had erased cities. It possessed the atomic bomb when no one else did. Power on that scale does something subtle. It changes how you interpret resistance. When you win a total war through overwhelming production and technological superiority, you internalize a formula. More output equals more control. More bombs equals faster surrender. This formula had worked against Germany. It had worked against Japan. It seemed to hold in Korea. Even when the war stalled, the peninsula did not fall entirely to communism. That felt like strategic containment. And containment became doctrine. The Cold War reframed every regional conflict as part of a global ledger. Influence was counted like territory on a board. Alliances were insurance policies. Losses were contagions. Vietnam entered the American mind not as a country with its own history of colonial resistance, first against China, then France, but as a square on a geopolitical grid. If it fell, others might fall. Not because they shared identical conditions, but because perception mattered. Washington feared something intangible: credibility decay. If the United States signaled weakness, would NATO doubt? Would Japan reconsider alignment? Would smaller nations hedge toward Moscow or Beijing? This is where strategy blurred into psychology. Vietnam was not initially about rice paddies. It was about signaling resolve. And here is the critical flaw. Resolve is only persuasive if the opponent values what you are threatening. North Vietnam did not operate within America's fear structure. For Washington, defeat meant reputational damage. For Hanoi, defeat meant national subjugation. Those are not symmetrical stakes. One side feared embarrassment, the other feared extinction. Industrial dominance bred confidence. Confidence hardened into certainty. Certainty dismissed doubt. Advisors who warned about guerrilla warfare complexities were noted and overruled. Intelligence assessments that questioned South Vietnam's political stability were filed and subordinated to strategic narrative. Because the underlying belief remained intact. America does not lose limited wars. It may struggle. It may negotiate, but it does not fail. This belief shaped escalation patterns. When early advisory missions did not stabilize the South, troop levels increased. When troop increases did not break insurgency momentum, bombing campaigns expanded. Each step was framed not as desperation, but as calibration. More force, slight adjustment. Reassert dominance. But there was a structural misunderstanding at the core. World War II had been a war of states with defined industrial centers. Vietnam was a war of political infiltration and decentralized endurance. Factories can be destroyed. Ideological conviction cannot be bombed into bankruptcy. Yet the US approached Vietnam with the habits of an industrial war machine. And those habits were reinforced by bureaucracy. Defense contractors thrived on expansion. Military careers advanced with operational scope. Political leaders feared being labeled weak. No president wanted to be the one who lost a country to communism. So the war deepened. Not because victory was clearly defined, but because retreat felt politically unacceptable. This is how superpowers drift. Not through chaos, through incremental commitment, justified by reputation management. Vietnam did not begin as a massive deployment. It began with advisors, then special forces, then air support, then ground troops, then hundreds of thousands of soldiers. At every stage, leaders believed they were preventing a larger catastrophe. But they never paused to interrogate the premise. Was Vietnam actually a domino? Or was it a nationalist revolution wearing Cold War colors to secure foreign backing? By the time that question gained traction, the machinery was already in motion. And machinery, once mobilized, resists reversal. The United States did not fail in Vietnam because it was weak. It failed because it believed its previous victories guaranteed future compliance. It mistook industrial supremacy for strategic omniscience, and in doing so, it entered a war whose terms it did not fully control. Next, we examine the battlefield mismatch. Not bombs versus rifles, but measurement versus meaning. Because the war America prepared to fight was not the war it actually entered. The American military did not enter Vietnam unprepared. It entered with doctrine, air mobility, rapid deployment, artillery saturation, search and destroy operations. Helicopters turned jungle into accessible terrain. Firebases projected power into rural zones. B-52s could flatten suspected supply corridors. Technology allowed surveillance beyond what earlier empires could imagine. On paper, this was overwhelming. But the war was not structured on paper. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were not optimized for conventional confrontation. They avoided fixed positions when possible. They dissolved into villages. They moved at night. They used terrain as infrastructure. And, most critically, they did not need to win decisive battles. They needed to survive them. American commanders required measurable indicators of progress. Washington demanded reports. Congress required justification. Voters needed reassurance. So a metric was chosen: body count. Enemy killed per operation. Kill ratios became the language of success. Briefings displayed rising numbers. Charts showed cumulative enemy losses. Statistical models projected attrition curves. If the US eliminated fighters faster than Hanoi could replace them, the insurgency would collapse under demographic pressure. It was clean math, except it assumed the enemy operated within the same framework of cost-benefit analysis. North Vietnam did not treat casualties as evidence of failure. It treated them as sacrifice within a long war of national unification. The United States calculated time in election cycles. Hanoi calculated time in generations. This asymmetry is fatal in attritional warfare. every major US engagement could be framed as tactical success. Superior firepower, higher enemy casualties, secured zones. But once troops withdrew, insurgent networks often reconstituted. Because the war was not about territory control in the conventional sense, it was about political loyalty at the village level. And loyalty is not secured through artillery. In many rural areas, civilians faced an impossible calculus. Cooperate with Americans during the day. Avoid retaliation from guerrillas at night. The insurgency did not need to control openly. It needed to remain present, and presence cannot be eliminated through periodic sweeps. Search and destroy missions intensified this contradiction. Villages suspected of harboring fighters were cleared. Crops were destroyed to deny food supply. Populations were relocated into strategic hamlets, meant to isolate insurgents. But forced relocation often alienated the very civilians whose support was essential. Each aggressive tactic designed to separate guerrillas from the population risked driving the population toward the guerrillas. Meanwhile, body count pressure filtered downward. Units were evaluated on results. Officers built careers on measurable impact. Soldiers operating in ambiguous environments were asked to distinguish insurgent from farmer in seconds. Ambiguity plus pressure produces distortion. Inflated numbers, misidentifications, aggressive assumptions. When metrics become currency, integrity erodes. The enemy understood this dynamic. They could afford casualties because their objective was political endurance, not battlefield dominance. The United States required visible progress to maintain domestic backing. The insurgency required only persistence. This is not a story of incompetence. American forces won numerous engagements decisively. It is a story of strategic misalignment. A conventional military machine, optimized for large-scale decisive conflict, was fighting a decentralized political war that did not reward decisive battles. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained functional despite relentless bombing. Supplies flowed through Laos and Cambodia via networks that were resilient precisely because they were low-tech and dispersed. Industrial firepower struggled against adaptive simplicity, and every year the numbers climbed. Troops deployed, bombs dropped, bodies counted. Yet the insurgency remained intact. The United States was measuring destruction. The enemy was measuring survival. Only one of those metrics determines victory in an insurgency. And it is not the one displayed in press briefings. Next, we examine the structural flaw beneath the battlefield: legitimacy. Because even the most powerful army cannot win a political war for a government its own citizens do not fully trust. And South Vietnam's foundation was already cracked. You can pour money into a regime. You can arm it, train it, build ministries, draft constitutions, print flags. But you cannot manufacture legitimacy with cargo planes. South Vietnam was not born stable. It emerged from the collapse of French colonial rule, carved artificially at the 17th parallel after the Geneva Accords. The division was supposed to be temporary. Elections were expected to unify the country. Those elections never came, because Washington feared the likely winner, Ho Chi Minh. So the South became a state defined less by organic consensus and more by geopolitical necessity. Enter No Din Diem, Catholic in a majority Buddhist country. Western educated, anti-communist, acceptable to Washington. But legitimacy is not awarded by foreign approval. Diem's government centralized power within a narrow elite circle. Political dissent was suppressed. Rural grievances festered. Buddhist protests were met with repression. Images of monks self-immolating were not just tragic, they were signals. The countryside was the true battleground, and in much of the countryside, the South Vietnamese government was seen not as protector, but as distant, corrupt, or coercive. This is the structural contradiction. The United States was fighting to preserve a government that large portions of its own population did not fully trust. That is not a military problem. It is a political one. When insurgents moved through villages, they weren't always perceived as foreign invaders. Many were locals, relatives, neighbors, people speaking the same dialect, sharing the same history of anti-colonial resistance. The Viet Cong framed their struggle not primarily as communism versus capitalism, but as national liberation and reunification. That framing resonated. Meanwhile, the Strategic Hamlet program attempted to isolate rural populations from insurgent influence by forcibly relocating them into fortified settlements. On paper, it looked rational. In practice, it uprooted families, disrupted agriculture, and often created resentment towards Saigon's authorities. Security without consent feels like occupation. And when American soldiers began operating in larger numbers, the visual dynamic shifted. Foreign troops, foreign language, foreign uniforms, operating in villages with centuries of history. No matter how disciplined individual units were, the optics were difficult to manage. Every accidental civilian death, every mistaken raid, every aggressive interrogation. Each incident compounded the perception that the war was externally driven. Corruption inside South Vietnam compounded the problem. Military promotions sometimes hinged on loyalty rather than competence. Supplies meant for soldiers disappeared. Local officials extracted bribes. Stability built on patronage is brittle. Washington understood some of this. There were reports. There were warnings. There were internal debates. But the alternative, abandoning South Vietnam, was politically radioactive. So support continued and escalated. The United States found itself in a paradox. The more unstable the South became, the more American involvement seemed necessary to prevent collapse. But deeper involvement further undermined the South's claim to independent sovereignty. Dependence replaced autonomy. And insurgencies thrive where governments appear externally sustained. You cannot bomb legitimacy into existence. You cannot helicopter drop national cohesion. And yet, the war strategy increasingly relied on precisely that assumption, that sufficient security pressure would create political stability. But stability built from above rarely survives without roots below. By the late 1960s, South Vietnam existed in a suspended state, maintained by American funding, shielded by American air power, advised by American officers, but internally fragile. And fragility is fatal in long wars, because the enemy does not need to defeat you outright. It only needs to outlast the scaffolding holding you upright. Next, we move to something even more corrosive. Not in Saigon, not in Hanoi, but inside the United States itself. Because wars do not just burn foreign soil. They test the cohesion of the societies that wage them. At first, Vietnam was distant. Advisors, limited deployments, technical assistance. It barely interrupted American daily life. But escalation changes visibility. By 1968, over 500,000 US troops were in Vietnam. The draft was no longer abstract policy, it was personal risk. Televised footage brought jungle firefights into living rooms. Coffins returned quietly at first, then more frequently, and something fractured. The draft exposed inequality. College students could defer service. Working-class young men often could not. Minority communities were disproportionately represented in combat roles. The burden of containment was not evenly distributed. That imbalance did not go unnoticed. Protests began on campuses. Then they spread. Clergy marched. Veterans spoke out. Civil rights leaders questioned the morality of fighting abroad while inequality persisted at home. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. publicly condemned the war in 1967, calling it a moral and economic disaster that diverted resources from domestic reform. The war was no longer just foreign policy. It became a referendum on national identity. Was America defending freedom or imposing order abroad while failing to secure justice at home? Every televised bombing run, every civilian casualty report, every exposed atrocity. They didn't just challenge military strategy, they challenged moral narrative. Then came Tet. Militarily, US and South Vietnamese forces repelled the offensive. Insurgent losses were catastrophic. But perception does not track casualty ratios. It tracks shock. When Americans saw fighting inside the US Embassy compound in Saigon, the narrative of progress cracked. If the enemy was collapsing, how could they launch nationwide attacks? Trust eroded. President Lyndon B. Johnson's approval ratings fell sharply. He announced he would not seek re-election. Political capital, the invisible currency of war, was draining. And here is the structural reality democracies cannot escape. Wars require sustained consent, not unanimous support, but durable tolerance. Vietnam consumed that tolerance year by year. As casualties mounted past 20,000, then 30,000, then higher, families asked questions. Taxpayers felt inflation. Social programs competed for funding. The Great Society reforms Johnson envisioned began to strain under war expenditures. The United States was attempting to fight a prolonged counterinsurgency while maintaining domestic reform and Cold War global commitments. That is not just military strain. That is systemic overload. By 1970, protests intensified. The Kent State shootings, National Guard troops killing 4 students during an anti-war demonstration, symbolized a nation no longer arguing politely. The battlefield had migrated, not physically, psychologically. Every escalation in Vietnam now had domestic consequences. Every bombing campaign risked not only foreign backlash, but domestic outrage. North Vietnam did not need to invade American territory. It needed to endure until American patience thinned beyond recovery. And patience is finite in electoral systems. Presidents face re-election. Congress faces voters. Media cycles amplified doubt. Time, once assumed to favor the superpower, began favoring the insurgent. Because while American strategy measured success in attrition curves and sortie numbers, public opinion measured success in an absence of funerals. The war was no longer just a military contest. It was a race between battlefield endurance and democratic fatigue. And fatigue was spreading. Next, we confront the turning point that crystallized everything. Not a single firefight, not a single policy memo, but a moment when the illusion of controlled escalation collapsed completely. The Tet Offensive, where tactical victory produced strategic damage, and the war's psychological center shifted permanently. January 1968, Lunar New Year. Tet was supposed to be a temporary pause, a cultural ceasefire observed in previous years. South Vietnamese forces relaxed posture. Many soldiers went home to families. Then the cities exploded. More than 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Saigon, Hue, provincial capitals, military bases. Even the U.S. Embassy compound was breached. Militarily, it was reckless. Insurgents suffered devastating losses. Entire networks were wiped out. In raw battlefield terms, it was a catastrophe for the North. But war is not scored solely in casualties. It is scored in perception. For years, American officials had insisted the enemy was weakening, that progress was measurable, that victory, while gradual, was inevitable. Tet contradicted that narrative in a single week. If the insurgency was collapsing, how could it strike nationwide? If American intelligence was superior, how had preparations gone undetected? Television carried images of urban firefights into American homes. Smoke rising over Saigon. Marines clearing buildings room by room. The ancient city of Hue reduced to rubble after weeks of brutal combat. The psychological effect was immediate. Even trusted news figures began shifting tone. Walter Cronkite, one of the most respected broadcasters in the United States, concluded publicly that the war appeared mired in stalemate. When credibility fractures at that level, confidence erodes rapidly. Inside Washington, leaders understood the military reality. Tet had weakened the enemy severely, but they could not reverse the emotional impact. The American public had absorbed a different message. This war is not ending. And if it is not ending, why are we fighting it? Tet exposed a deeper problem: the gap between official optimism and battlefield complexity. For years, metrics had been curated, body counts highlighted, pacified zones reported, progress charts presented. Tet suggested those charts were incomplete at best, misleading at worst. Once trust declines, every subsequent statement faces suspicion. This is the inflection point where Vietnam transformed from controversial conflict to credibility crisis. President Lyndon B. Johnson recognized the shift. Weeks after Tet, he announced a halt to much of the bombing campaign and declared he would not seek another term. A sitting president stepping aside during wartime is not routine. It is evidence of systemic strain. North Vietnam did not win Tet militarily, but it won something more durable: time. From this point forward, American strategy operated under a shrinking political clock. Escalation risked backlash. Withdrawal risked humiliation. Stalemate drained resources. All three paths carried cost. Tet did not defeat American forces. It defeated the assumption that the war was under control. And once control is questioned in a democracy, authority weakens. The battlefield continued. Casualties continued. Bombing intensified in some regions. But something fundamental had shifted. The war was no longer about achieving victory. It became about managing exit without visible defeat. That transition is subtle. but once it happens, outcomes narrow. Next, we examine what happens when a superpower begins preparing to leave a war it cannot publicly admit it has lost. Vietnamization, the attempt to transfer burden, and the structural limits of that strategy. When Richard Nixon entered office in 1969, the war was already politically radioactive. He understood something simple. America could not escalate indefinitely, but it also could not leave abruptly without global consequences. So the strategy shifted. Vietnamization. The concept was elegant on paper. Gradually withdraw US troops. Transfer combat responsibility to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Continue supplying weapons, training, and financial support. Maintain air power as insurance. In theory, this would preserve South Vietnam while reducing American casualties, easing domestic pressure without conceding defeat. But theory collided with structural reality. For years, South Vietnam's military had operated under American shadow. US forces handled heavy logistics, intelligence integration, air coordination, and large-scale operations. Even when ARVN units fought bravely, and many did, the operational backbone was American. Vietnamization required compressing years of dependency into a short timeline. Weapons flowed in massive quantities. Modern rifles, artillery, aircraft. Training programs expanded. Advisors intensified instruction. But equipment does not equal cohesion. ARVN faced internal challenges. Leadership politicization, morale inconsistencies, desertion issues. Command structures influenced by patronage. Some units performed well, others fractured under pressure. Meanwhile, Nixon expanded bombing beyond Vietnam's borders into Laos and Cambodia to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The logic was consistent with earlier strategy. Increase pressure, buy time, degrade enemy logistics. But widening the war destabilized neighboring states and fueled additional insurgencies, most notably the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Exit strategies often generate unintended consequences. Domestically, troop numbers fell steadily. American casualties declined. Protest intensity lessened compared to the peak years. From a political standpoint, Vietnamization worked, temporarily. From a structural standpoint, it was fragile. Because the North Vietnamese strategy had not changed. Endure, wait, exploit weakness. Hanoi understood American patience was finite. It calculated that once US ground forces withdrew substantially, the balance would shift. And time continued to compress. The Paris Peace Accords in 1973 formalized US withdrawal. American prisoners of war were returned. Combat troops left. On paper, South Vietnam remained sovereign. In practice, it was exposed. US air power could still intervene, but domestic appetite for renewed escalation was nearly non-existent. Congress increasingly restricted funding and military engagement authority. This is the hidden vulnerability of prolonged wars in democracies. Once withdrawal begins, re-escalation becomes politically near impossible. North Vietnam tested this reality in 1975. Conventional forces advanced rapidly. ARVN units, without robust American air support and facing logistical breakdowns, began collapsing in sequence. Cities fell faster than analysts predicted. Not because every soldier lacked courage, but because the scaffolding had been removed. Years of dependency, cannot be undone by decree. Saigon fell in April 1975. Helicopters lifted personnel from rooftops. Desperate civilians crowded embassy gates. Images circulated globally within hours. The war that began as a limited advisory mission ended with evacuation under pressure. Vietnamization did not fail because the concept was irrational. It failed because it attempted to compress structural weakness into a timeline dictated by American domestic politics rather than Vietnamese realities. The United States sought an exit that preserved credibility. But credibility cannot survive visible collapse, and the collapse was visible. Next, we confront the final scene. Not just the fall of Saigon, but what that fall meant. For military doctrine, for global perception, for the limits of power itself. April 30th, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The flag changed. The war ended. But the collapse did not begin that morning. It had been unfolding in slow motion for years. When U.S. ground troops left in 1973, South Vietnam retained equipment, funding pipelines, and formal sovereignty. On paper, it possessed one of the largest air forces in the region. It had armor, artillery, and trained divisions. What it lacked was strategic insulation. Congressional fatigue reduced military aid. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Spare parts dwindled. Air support became inconsistent. Morale declined as northern advances gained speed. The final North Vietnamese offensive in 1975 was conventional. Armored columns, coordinated assaults, rapid territorial capture. And South Vietnamese defenses collapsed faster than most intelligence projections had anticipated. Why? Because systems held together by external reinforcement tend to unravel quickly once that reinforcement disappears. Cities fell in sequence. Units retreated chaotically. Civilians fled in waves. And then the images that defined the war's end. Helicopters lifting off embassy rooftops. Crowds pressing against gates. Papers burning inside offices. The most powerful military in the world was not defeated in a decisive pitched battle. It was strategically exhausted. That distinction matters. The United States lost nearly 58,000 service members. Vietnam lost millions, soldiers and civilians combined. The physical destruction across Southeast Asia was immense. Chemical defoliants scarred landscapes and bodies for generations. But beyond the casualties and the ruined cities, Vietnam exposed something more fundamental. Industrial scale does not guarantee political victory. You can dominate airspace. You can control sea lanes. You can outspend your opponent tenfold. But if your objective requires sustaining a foreign political order that lacks deep internal legitimacy, force becomes maintenance, not solution. Vietnam also revealed the vulnerability of democracies in prolonged asymmetric wars. Public consent is not infinite. Economic patience is not infinite. Trust in official narrative is not infinite. North Vietnam understood this. It did not need to match American production. It needed to survive American attention span. And it did. The fall of Saigon was not just a Vietnamese event. It recalibrated global perception. Allies questioned the reliability of U.S. commitments under sustained pressure. Adversaries studied the lesson carefully. Protracted insurgency can neutralize superior technology. Inside the United States, doctrine shifted. The draft ended. The all-volunteer force emerged. Military planners reassessed counterinsurgency models. War powers constraints expanded congressional oversight. Future interventions would carry the ghost of Vietnam, sometimes restraining action, sometimes distorting it. Vietnam did not make America weak, but it forced recognition of limits. Limits of force, limits of narrative control, limits of reputation as strategy. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth: war crimes, strategic overreach, and political miscalculation were not isolated anomalies within the conflict. They were symptoms of a deeper misalignment between objective and method. When a nation cannot clearly define victory, it begins substituting activity for progress, bombing for strategy, metrics for meaning, escalation for coherence. Eventually, reality asserts itself. The United States did not collapse because of Vietnam, but it was forced to confront a question it had not seriously faced since its rise to global dominance. What happens when overwhelming power meets a conflict it cannot restructure on its own terms? Vietnam answered, "Power has reach. It does not have omnipotence." And once a superpower learns that lesson, it never fully unlearns it. War crimes in Vietnam were not random lightning strikes. They emerged from pressure, from doctrine, from incentives, and from a strategic design that blurred the line between combatant and civilian. Let's be precise. The My Lai massacre in 1968 was one of the most infamous atrocities. Hundreds of unarmed civilians were killed by US soldiers. Women assaulted, children executed, villages burned. It shocked the American public when exposed. But My Lai was not born in a vacuum. It occurred inside a system where success was measured by enemy killed. Villages were classified as hostile by default. Guerrillas operated without uniforms. Frustration built from invisible enemies. When soldiers are told that the enemy hides among civilians, and promotions, evaluations, and praise depend on kill ratios, moral guardrails erode. This does not excuse the act. It explains the architecture around it. Then there was the Phoenix program, officially designed to dismantle Viet Cong infrastructure through intelligence targeting. In practice, it became associated with torture, extrajudicial killings, and detention without due process. Thousands were neutralized. How many were actual insurgent operatives? How many were victims of mistaken identity, personal vendettas, or corrupt informants? The records remain contested. And then, chemical warfare. Not in the gas chamber sense of World War II, but in ecological devastation. Agent Orange and other defoliants were sprayed to strip jungle cover and destroy crops. The objective was tactical visibility and food denial. The long-term consequences: birth defects, cancer clusters, environmental collapse across regions. Military necessity was the justification. Intergenerational damage was the outcome. Bombing campaigns extended into Laos and Cambodia, countries not formally central to the declared war effort. Entire rural areas were saturated with explosives in attempts to disrupt supply routes. The scale was enormous, and many civilians bore the brunt. Here is the structural pattern. When victory remains undefined, escalation fills the vacuum. When escalation fails to produce resolution, harsher methods creep in. Not always by explicit order, often by gradual normalization. Language shifts first. Free fire zones. Neutralize. Collateral damage. Each term creates emotional distance. Distance allows repetition. Repetition dulls scrutiny. This is how policy can produce atrocity without formal declaration of intent. Now, important clarity. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces committed atrocities as well. Assassinations of village officials, executions during Tet in Hue, re-education camps after victory. Vietnam was not morally one-sided, but the United States positioned itself as defender of rules-based order. When violations occurred under that banner, the reputational damage was amplified, and accountability was limited. Lieutenant William Calley was convicted for his role in My Lai, and ultimately served only a fraction of his sentence under house arrest. Few high-level architects of broader strategies faced legal consequence. This reinforced a perception, domestically and internationally, that power insulated decision-makers from full responsibility. War crimes in Vietnam did not occur because American society was uniquely cruel. They occurred because prolonged asymmetric war under political pressure corrodes restraint. When soldiers cannot distinguish enemy from civilian, when objectives shift without clarity, when political leaders fear withdrawal more than moral compromise, atrocity risk rises. Vietnam left a scar not just on Southeast Asia, but on American civil-military trust. It forced reforms in rules of engagement, professional training, media transparency, and oversight. It also planted a deeper anxiety. If overwhelming power can drift into systemic brutality under stress, what prevents it from happening again? That question did not disappear in 1975. It resurfaced in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in every counterinsurgency since. Vietnam was not merely a failed war. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when strategy outruns legitimacy, when reputation outweighs reality, when metrics replace meaning, and when a nation confuses persistence with purpose. We've now built the full structural arc. Assumption of invincibility, misreading of nationalism, industrial doctrine versus guerrilla endurance, hollow ally state, domestic fracture, narrative collapse, exit without admission, final fall, and the moral reckoning. If you want one final piece, we can write a closing epilogue, something colder, almost surgical, comparing Vietnam's structural failures to modern interventions. Or we can tighten this into a production-ready script flow with pacing beats and emphasis cues for narration. You tell me the next move. Vietnam did not end in 1975. It embedded itself in doctrine, in hesitation, in overcorrection, in silence. The United States did not become isolationist after Saigon. It did not dismantle its military power. It did not abandon global influence. But something changed beneath the surface. The draft ended. The all-volunteer force emerged, professionalized, insulated from broad civilian exposure. Wars would be fought by fewer families. Political risk would be managed differently. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, attempting to reclaim authority over extended military engagement. The executive branch adjusted how it framed interventions, limited actions, peacekeeping missions, counterterrorism operations. The language evolved, but the tension remained. Vietnam proved that technological superiority does not guarantee political control. Firepower cannot manufacture legitimacy, and insurgent movements measure time differently than democracies. These lessons were studied intensely inside military institutions. Counterinsurgency manuals were rewritten, intelligence coordination restructured, media engagement recalibrated. And yet, when the United States entered Iraq in 2003, the initial campaign resembled a familiar pattern: shock and awe, rapid regime collapse, confidence in reconstruction timelines. But insurgency followed. In Afghanistan, the world's most advanced coalition faced decentralized networks willing to endure decades. The terrain was different. The ideology was different. But the structural tension felt familiar. External force attempting to stabilize complex internal political ecosystems. Vietnam's ghost was not about jungle warfare. It was about misalignment between objective and method, between narrative and reality, between duration of commitment and tolerance of cost. Here is the uncomfortable symmetry. Vietnam was entered to prevent credibility loss. Iraq was justified in part through credibility projection. Afghanistan was sustained for years to avoid the appearance of abandonment. Reputation is a powerful motivator. But Vietnam demonstrated that credibility enforced through prolonged entanglement can erode the very strength it seeks to preserve. The deeper lesson was not never intervene. It was define victory precisely. Align means with political reality. Understand local legitimacy before imposing structure. And never confuse escalation with progress. Vietnam forced the United States to confront its limits. Not military weakness, but strategic overreach. A superpower can destroy. It can deter. It can influence. But it cannot easily redesign societies from above without absorbing immense cost. And when that cost becomes visible, in casualties, in protest, in exposed atrocity, domestic consent becomes the decisive battlefield. Vietnam did not destroy American power. It recalibrated it. It introduced caution. It seeded skepticism. It made future presidents aware that once ground troops deploy into complex civil conflicts, exit is never simple. And it left a permanent reminder carved in black granite in Washington, D.C. Names. Not statistics, not policy memos. Names. Because in the end, strategy debates resolve into human consequence. Vietnam was a failure not because soldiers lacked courage, not because the military lacked capacity. It failed because the objectives were misaligned with the political, cultural, and historical realities on the ground. And when that misalignment persists long enough, force becomes maintenance. Maintenance becomes escalation. Escalation becomes corrosion. Until the system chooses withdrawal, or collapse chooses it. Vietnam chose both. And every modern intervention since has operated in its shadow. When Saigon fell, the cameras left. History didn't. For Vietnam, victory did not mean peace. It meant consolidation. Former South Vietnamese officials, military officers, intellectuals. Many were sent to re-education camps. Some stayed for months, others for years. Property was seized. Political structures were dismantled. The new unified government moved to eliminate dissent and restructure society under centralized control. Hundreds of thousands fled. They left by sea in fragile boats, risking pirates, storms, starvation. The world would come to know them as the boat people, Many never reached shore. The war had ended. The instability had not. Land scarred by bombardment remained contaminated. Unexploded ordnance continued killing civilians decades later. Agent Orange lingered in soil and bloodlines. Generations were born with deformities linked to chemical exposure. War does not end when treaties are signed. It seeps into groundwater, into genetics, into memory. And inside the United States, veterans returned not to parades, but to division. Some were welcomed warmly. Others were met with indifference, even hostility, symbols of a war many civilians wanted to forget. Post-traumatic stress was poorly understood. Substance abuse rose among some returning soldiers. Trust between civilian society and military institutions strained under political fallout. Vietnam altered the American psyche. Before Vietnam, large-scale military intervention felt like a tool of confident global management. After Vietnam, it felt heavier, more complicated, suspicious, and something else shifted. The relationship between government narrative and public trust. The Pentagon Papers revealed that successive administrations had misled the public about progress and internal assessments. That revelation did not simply criticize one president. It eroded institutional credibility. When citizens discover that optimism was curated while doubt was concealed, skepticism becomes permanent. This is Vietnam's longest shadow. Not just military recalibration, but epistemic fracture. The public began questioning official claims in future conflicts more aggressively. Media scrutiny intensified. Transparency became political currency. Vietnam did not create distrust in American governance, but it accelerated it. And distrust, once normalized, rarely recedes completely. For Southeast Asia, the war destabilized neighboring Cambodia and Laos. Power vacuums and bombardment patterns contributed to radicalization and civil catastrophe, most infamously under the Khmer Rouge regime. Regional shockwaves outlived the original battlefield. For the global Cold War balance, the domino theory did not unfold as predicted. Southeast Asia did not cascade uniformly into ideological alignment. International politics proved more nuanced than the original containment model assumed, which raises the uncomfortable retrospective question. If the worst-case domino collapse never materialized, what exactly was the cost justified against? Vietnam forces a recalibration of how nations evaluate risk. It demonstrates that hypothetical geopolitical loss can produce real human devastation if misjudged. And it underscores something brutal about superpower psychology. Fear of appearing weak can produce decisions that generate actual weakness. But here is the final nuance. Vietnam was not proof that America is incapable of projecting power. It was proof that projecting power without deep alignment between political objective and social reality produces entropy. The United States learned from Vietnam. It professionalized its military. It refined doctrine. It adjusted oversight mechanisms. Yet the temptation to believe in controllable escalation never disappears fully. Every generation of leaders believes they have better intelligence, better tools, better models. Vietnam whispers otherwise. It says, understand before intervening. Define victory before deploying. Calculate time honestly. And remember that war crimes rarely begin as policy objectives. They begin as pressure distortions inside prolonged conflict. This war did not end in triumph. It ended in exhaustion. And exhaustion is not a strategic achievement. It is a warning.